Let's dive into today's session, one that's going to make you think about history in a way you might not have before. It's said that history is written by the victors, but what does that really mean? As we peel back the layers, we'll find that the stories we're told about the past, about those we see as heroes, are often just one side of a much more complex tale. Think about the people we've come to idolize through history. Their speeches are quoted, their faces grace monuments, and their legacies are celebrated. But if we dig deeper, we often find that these same figures were not as perfect as we've been led to believe. The reality is that history books are written by people with an agenda. The narrative is crafted by those who emerged victorious, and they paint themselves as courageous, noble, and just. They erase their darker deeds, their failures, and sometimes they even bend the truth. It's not always about facts, it's about who controls the narrative. When you read an article, an old book, or even a modern Wikipedia page, always remember that the author had a point of view, a bias, and often a desire to protect their own reputation or their groups. It's human nature. We want to make our side look like the good guys. And for generations, people have bought into these stories, handed down through textbooks and retellings, believing them without question. But when you start to question the narrative, you realize just how many layers of complexity exist. There's a famous quote that goes, "History is written by the victors." And one of the men who understood this concept better than most was Winston Churchill. His story is one that many of us know. But how much do we really know about the man behind the legend? Even today, Churchill is revered as one of Britain's greatest leaders. In fact, not long ago, he was voted the greatest Briton of all time, outranking even Shakespeare, Darwin, and Queen Elizabeth. But what's the real story? Churchill was born into wealth and privilege in 1874. His family was part of Britain's elite aristocracy, and from a young age, it was clear that he was driven by ambition. By the time he was 25, he had already written 3 books, run for parliament, and participated in 3 wars. When Britain went to war in South Africa, Churchill saw it as a golden opportunity to make a name for himself. The London Morning Post paid him handsomely to report on the conflict, and his dispatches were full of brilliant prose and historical insight. He wasn't just a journalist, he was a man of action, unafraid of taking risks. But here's where his story starts to sound more like an adventure novel. In 1899, Churchill was traveling on a train when it was ambushed by enemy forces. Even though he wasn't a soldier, he leaped into action, directing troops and helping them escape. But Churchill wasn't so lucky. He was captured and thrown into a prisoner of war camp. For 2 months, he endured boredom and frustration. Then one night he made his move. He scaled the prison's fence, ran into the darkness, and embarked on a daring escape that took him through enemy territory. At one point, he sought refuge with a local coal mine manager, who, by sheer luck, turned out to be an Englishman willing to help him. Churchill's dramatic escape made headlines, and he returned to Britain a hero. He wasn't satisfied with that, though. He wanted more. He returned to the battlefield, continuing to fight and write about the war. His bravery seemed boundless. During one battle, a bullet even severed a feather on his hat, a close call that only added to his growing legend. When the war ended, Churchill rode into Pretoria to free prisoners of war, ironically, in the same place where he had once been held captive. Fast forward a few decades, and Churchill's name would become synonymous with World War II. Before the war, he was one of the few who warned of the dangers posed by Nazi Germany. He was ridiculed for it at first, dismissed as overly dramatic, but when Hitler's rise became undeniable, the public rallied behind Churchill. When Neville Chamberlain resigned as Prime Minister, Churchill took the reins and led Britain through its darkest hour. His speeches became iconic, full of determination and grit, blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Churchill's leadership during the war is often credited as the reason the Allies triumphed over Hitler. He inspired a nation with his unwavering resolve and his ability to forge strong alliances, particularly with the United States. For many, Churchill is seen as the ultimate war hero, the man who saved Western democracy. But here's the part of the story we don't always hear. Churchill, the man who is celebrated for his bravery and leadership, was also deeply flawed. He held troubling beliefs about race and empire, and his policies led to suffering for millions. During the Bengal famine of 1943, which took place in British-controlled India, millions of people starved to death. Yet, Churchill continued to divert food supplies away from India, even as people were dying. He famously remarked that the famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits. Churchill also advocated for the use of chemical weapons against uncivilized tribes in the Middle East and supported brutal colonial policies that dehumanized entire populations. For all his talk of fighting for freedom, he was, at heart, a man who believed in the superiority of the British Empire and the subjugation of other races. This is the paradox of Churchill's legacy. On one hand, he was a leader who fought to stop the spread of fascism, but on the other hand, he was a man who believed in imperialism and racial hierarchy. The truth is, history is full of figures like Churchill, people who achieved great things, but who also had dark sides that are often glossed over or conveniently forgotten. The saying, "History is written by the victors," reminds us that we need to question the stories we're told. We need to remember that the people who wrote our history books often had their own agendas. They wanted to present themselves as heroes, as the ones who brought civilization to the world. But in doing so, they erased the voices of those they oppressed. They rewrote the facts to suit their narrative. So the next time you hear about the great men and women of history, remember to dig a little deeper. Ask yourself whose version of events you're hearing, and what parts of the story might be missing. Because history, as it's often told, is just one version of the truth. And more often than not, it's a version written by those who held the power. The real lesson here is to always question, always dig deeper, and never take history at face value. The victors may write the history books, but it's up to us to seek out the untold stories, to listen to the voices that were silenced, and to understand that the truth is often more complicated than the version we're handed. Keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep rising above the narratives that seek to confine your understanding of the past.